The Beatles saved their final show from the police against all odds. Candlestick Park, San Francisco, August 29th, 1966, 6:47 p.m. The Beatles sat in their dressing room, staring at the door. Outside, 25,000 fans were screaming. Inside, 3 police officers were telling them the concert was cancelled. "You can't perform tonight," said Captain Richard Morrison of the San Francisco Police Department. "We've received credible threats. Your safety cannot be guaranteed." John Lennon looked at Paul McCartney. Paul looked at George Harrison. George looked at Ringo Starr. They all knew what this meant. This was supposed to be their final concert. The last time the Beatles would ever perform live together. The end of an era. And now, 30 minutes before showtime, the police were telling them it was over. But what the police didn't know was that the Beatles had no intention of going quietly. "Captain," John said, lighting a cigarette with hands that were steadier than they should have been, "with all due respect, we're playing this show." "Mr. Lennon, you don't understand. We have intelligence that—" "No," John interrupted. "You don't understand. There are 25,000 people out there who paid to see us. We're not leaving them disappointed." Captain Morrison's face turned red. "This isn't a request. This is a direct order from the Chief of Police. If you attempt to go on that stage, we will arrest you for public endangerment." The room went silent, because everyone in that dressing room knew that Captain Morrison wasn't bluffing, and everyone knew that the Beatles weren't backing down. What happened next would become one of the most legendary moments in rock and roll history. Not because of the music, but because of what 4 boys from Liverpool were willing to risk for their fans. 3 days earlier, Los Angeles. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, received a phone call that made his blood run cold. "If the Beatles perform in San Francisco," the voice on the other end said, "they will not leave California alive." It wasn't the first threat. The Beatles had been receiving death threats for months, ever since John's infamous comment about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. Conservative groups had burned Beatles records. Radio stations had banned their music. And now, extremists were promising violence. But this threat was different. This caller knew details, the exact time of the concert, the route the Beatles would take from the airport, the hotel where they were staying. This wasn't just some angry fan making empty threats. This was someone with a plan. Brian immediately contacted the FBI. They took the threat seriously enough to assign agents to the Beatles' security detail. "We recommend canceling the San Francisco concert," FBI agent Thomas Crawford told Brian. "The risk is too high." "The Beatles don't cancel concerts," Brian replied. "Then the Beatles might not survive this one." Brian didn't tell the Beatles about the threat immediately. He knew what they'd say. They'd insist on performing anyway. And he was right. When he finally told them the morning of the concert, their reaction was exactly what he expected. "We're not canceling," John said flatly. "John, these people are serious. They could— I don't care. We made a commitment to our fans. We're keeping it." Paul, usually the diplomatic one, agreed. "Brian, we've faced angry crowds before. We'll face them again. But we're not going to let fear dictate what we do." George was quieter, but equally resolute. "If we cancel every time someone threatens us, we'll never perform again." Ringo, the peacemaker, tried to find middle ground. "Maybe we could postpone. Reschedule for when security is better." "No," John said. "This is our last concert. It ends on our terms, not theirs." Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Back in the dressing room at Candlestick Park, the standoff continued. Captain Morrison had called for backup. Now there were 6 police officers in the small dressing room, all telling the Beatles they couldn't perform. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, trying a different approach, "I understand your commitment to your fans, but if something happens to you on that stage, those same fans will witness it. Is that what you want?" It was a good point, and for a moment, the Beatles hesitated. Then they heard it. Through the walls, through the door, through everything, the sound of 25,000 people chanting, "We want the Beatles! We want the Beatles!" John walked to the door and opened it slightly. The roar of the crowd hit him like a physical force. He turned back to Captain Morrison. "You hear that? Those people traveled from all over the country to be here. Some of them saved for months to buy tickets. And you want us to tell them to go home because someone made a threat. Mr. Lennon, how many threats have we received this year, Brian?" John asked. Brian Epstein looked uncomfortable. "Hundreds. And how many times have we cancelled a show because of them?" "Never." "Exactly. So why start now?" Captain Morrison tried one more time. "Because this threat is credible. Because we have reason to believe—" "Then do your job," Paul interrupted. "Protect us, but don't tell us we can't perform." The captain looked at his officers. They looked back at him, waiting for orders. "If you go on that stage," Morrison said slowly, "and something happens, it's on you, not on us." "We understand," John said. "And if we determine at any point that the threat is imminent, we will pull you off that stage, forcibly if necessary." "Fair enough." Morrison shook his head. "You're all crazy." "Probably," Ringo said with a small smile, "but we're crazy together." 7:17 p.m. The Beatles walked onto the stage at Candlestick Park to the loudest roar any of them had ever heard. But this time, it felt different, because they knew this was the last time they'd hear that sound, the last time they'd feel that energy, the last time they'd be the Beatles on stage together. John looked out at the sea of faces and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear of the threats, not fear of violence, fear that this moment would end, that this chapter of their lives was closing, that nothing would ever be the same again. "Hello, San Francisco," Paul shouted into the microphone. The crowd went insane. They opened with rock and roll music, then "She's a Woman," then "If I Needed Someone." But something was wrong. The sound system was terrible. The Beatles could barely hear themselves over the screaming. The monitors weren't working properly, and surrounding the stage, instead of the usual security guards, were dozens of police officers, all scanning the crowd, all looking for threats. Yeah, it was the most tense concert the Beatles had ever played. Between songs, FBI agents were in constant communication with the police. Every suspicious movement in the crowd was investigated. Every bag was searched. The Beatles knew all of this was happening. They could see it, feel it, but they kept playing. Halfway through the set, during Nowhere Man, something happened. A commotion in the crowd. People screaming. Not the usual fans screaming. Something different. Police officers rushed toward the disturbance. The Beatles kept playing, but their eyes were on the crowd. Captain Morrison appeared at the side of the stage, speaking urgently into his radio. Then he looked at the Beatles and made a cutting motion across his throat. "Stop. Now." But the Beatles didn't stop. John saw Morrison's signal. This saw the police moving through the crowd, saw the panic starting to spread. And he made a decision. Instead of stopping, he started playing louder, singing with more intensity, demanding the audience's attention. Paul, George, and Ringo followed his lead. They turned what should have been a gentle, introspective song into a defiant anthem. The crowd, sensing something was happening but not sure what, focused back on the stage. The disturbance in the crowd turned out to be a false alarm. Someone had fainted. The screaming was people trying to get help. But for those few minutes, the Beatles had made a choice. They chose to keep playing, to keep the show going, to refuse to let fear win. Captain Morrison would later say, "In that moment, I understood why they were the Beatles. It wasn't just the music. It was the courage." As the concert neared its end, the Beatles knew they had one song left, their final song ever. They had chosen it carefully. Not one of their biggest hits, not something flashy or dramatic. They chose Long Tall Sally, a rock and roll song, simple, pure, the kind of music that made them fall in love with performing in the first place. Before they started, John did something unexpected. He walked to the front of the stage and spoke directly to the crowd. "San Francisco," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stadium. "There's been some complications tonight. Some people didn't want us to play this show." The crowd booed. "But you know what? We don't care what they want. We care what you want. And you want rock and roll." The crowd erupted. So this last song is for everyone who told us we couldn't be here tonight. For everyone who tried to stop us. For everyone who thought fear was stronger than music." He looked at Paul, George, and Ringo. "And it's for us, because we're the Beatles, and nobody tells us when to stop." They launched into Long Tall Sally, with an energy that surprised even them. Paul screamed the lyrics like his life depended on it. John's guitar was louder than it had been all night. George and Ringo drove the rhythm like they were trying to shake the stadium's foundation. It was raw, chaotic, perfect. And when it ended, when that final note rang out across Candlestick Park, the Beatles stood together on stage for one last moment. 25,000 people screaming. Police officers watching. FBI agents monitoring. And 4 boys from Liverpool who had just played their final concert together. Against all odds. The Beatles walked off the stage at Candlestick Park and never performed live together again. The threats that night turned out to be mostly empty. No violence occurred. No one was hurt. But the decision the Beatles made to perform despite the danger, despite the police warnings, despite everything, became legendary. They taught us something important that night, Captain Morrison said years later. They taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right, even when you're afraid. The concert itself was recorded, though the audio quality was poor. But bootleg copies circulated for years, treasured not for the music quality, but for what they represented. The last time. Paul McCartney, in interviews decades later, would say, "We didn't know if we'd made the right decision that night. We didn't know if we were being brave or just stupid. But we knew we couldn't let our fans down." John Lennon, before his death, reflected, "Candlestick Park was the end of the Beatles as a live band. But it was also proof that we were more than just musicians. We were fighters, and we went out fighting." The story of that final concert became a parable about artistic integrity, about refusing to be silenced, about the relationship between performers and their audience, and about four young men who, when faced with the choice between safety and commitment, chose to keep their promise. Today, there's a plaque at the site where Candlestick Park once stood. It reads, "Here, on August 29th, 1966, the Beatles performed their final concert. Despite threats, and despite danger, despite everything, they played for their fans, for their art, for each other. The Beatles saved their final show from the police that night. But really, they saved something more important. They saved the idea that music matters more than fear, that connection matters more than safety, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up, even when everything tells you not to." The end. If this story about courage, commitment, and the power of refusing to be silenced moved you, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep your promises, no matter what. What performance or moment of courage has inspired you most? Tell us in the comments below.